Ontario Premier Doug Ford says his province is making progress. COVID cases are dropping, but not enough yet to loosen restrictions. He is warning residents that the feds could undo all that progress if they don't tighten measures at the border. And he has written now a third letter to the Prime Minister urging Ottawa to close border loopholes and keep the variants out. We've got Bill Blair, the Minister of Public Safety, to talk about this. Minister Blair, thank you very much for joining us. And, I've got the Premier's letter here, and I'm going to just go from it because there are three issues that he's raised. The first one is reducing international flights. I know you've already addressed this multiple times and said to Premier Ford, which flights would you have us reduce? But I want to go to the second one and ask you about this idea of doing mandatory testing for all domestic air travelers. Premier Ford talks about Ontario. Other provinces, British Columbia, for instance, have said that they would support that idea. Will the federal government introduce mandatory testing for domestic air travelers?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if I may, David, I think it's really important that I would encourage Ontario to look at their own data. I know they've got some serious problems and they've implemented a lockdown, which I support, but they've got problems in their workplaces and in social gatherings. But their own data tells us that just as an example, yesterday, they had 2,320 cases reported in Ontario yesterday. 0 of those were related to travel. And so I would frankly disagree. I would encourage the Premier to look at his data, listen to his health experts, and let's act on the facts. And frankly, we see an effort to deflect and to distract from a very serious concern that everyone has in Ontario. But we have, and I think it's important to acknowledge, we have taken extraordinary measures in Canada to close down our international borders to non-essential travel. We've seen a 96% reduction in international travel in this country. And at the same time, we, by necessity, had to allow Canadians to return home because they have a constitutional right to do so. And we allowed for the movement of essential workers and essential goods into this country. But we've managed it in a very vigorous way. And for everyone coming into this country, we do require a pre-arrival test. We test them again when they get to the border and again 8 days later.
So, Minister Blair, I hear you saying that, but I just want to ask about the domestic side of things for a moment, because we've heard you talk about the international side, the requirement for the PCR test. There are calls to have that same standard for domestic flights. And if I look just at an analysis done by our colleagues at Radio Canada over a 2-week period, that at a minimum there were 17 flights, domestic flights a day, carrying travelers who later tested positive for COVID. So there clearly are people traveling on domestic flights. Do you think a PCR test is warranted before people can get on a domestic flight?
Well, David, if any of our provinces are interested in doing this, and I have conversations on a daily basis with my provincial counterparts about how it's working. And for example, the Maritimes and the Atlantic provinces established their own travel bubble, and they put in significant restrictions, including testing and quarantine. The provinces have the authority to do that. We manage, and federally, we manage the international border with agencies such as the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canadian Border Services Agency. Interprovincial travel is primarily under the purview and responsibility of the provinces. We've already seen...
But this is air travel, which is a federal responsibility. It's your responsibility. When you talk about whether provinces are calling for this, it's in his letter. It's the second point. It's in Ford's letter asking for PCR testing of domestic flights.
If the Premier wants to implement measures restricting travel into Ontario from anywhere domestically in Canada, he has the authority to do that, and we're happy to work with him. But quite frankly, on a number of the things that he's asked about, he asked us to close the border to international non-essential travel. We did that 14 months ago. He's asked us to take a number of steps. 4 months ago, the Premier was asking us to actually eliminate the quarantine period. We disagreed because, quite frankly, the quarantine has been our most effective measure in protecting Canadians and keeping the virus out of Canada. Not perfectly, by the way. No country has been perfect, David, but the restrictions that Canada has put in its international borders have been very effective. They remain among the most rigorous in the world. And I think we've demonstrated from the very first day our willingness to keep on adding additional layers of protection. We banned direct flights from countries that were identified as hotspots. We took additional measures to prevent connecting flights from those jurisdictions to ensure that we slowed down and prevented those variants from coming into the country. And when people do arrive in this country, we manage their arrival through mandatory quarantine periods and a very, very rigorous testing regime.
So we do that at air travel points. What about at land border? Because that's just to sort of get to Premier Ford's third point, and that is to say that he would like to see the same standard imposed at land borders, that people are required to go for 3 days to a quarantine hotel, which under your rules right now they are not.
Yeah, just to be really clear, first of all of the requirements of pre-arrival testing, post-arrival testing, and 14-day quarantine are enforced vigorously at our land borders. And in fact, we've got a 99.6% compliance. And when people are not compliant with that, there are substantial consequences and fines that are imposed. The reason we put in place the 3-day hotel stays for international air travel is because many people who fly into, for example, the Toronto International Airport could connect to a flight going on to Winnipeg or Thunder Bay or Halifax or any other place in Canada. And so in order to ensure that those individuals were safe before they traveled onward, we required them to stay in a government-assisted accommodation for 3 days while they await the results of another PCR test post-arrival. That's why that measure was put in place. When people arrive at our land borders, David, they're often Canadians returning from summer residence in the United States. When that happens, they're driving their car, they may have the dog in the car. They have the ability, frankly, for them, the safest travel home is directly home after they've submitted the pre-arrival test and submitted to another post-arrival test. They're ordered into quarantine, and to go straight home to quarantine is the safest way to manage those people. I'd also point out to the Premier and to you that there are 117 different border points, land border points across this country, and many of them are hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest hotel. The safest and most effective way to manage people who are arriving at our borders by land is by the system that we've put in place, which includes quarantine and rigorous pre, post, and then a second post-arrival test.
Finally, Minister, I want to ask you about charter flights, because our own reporting has found dozens of chartered planes landing at Canadian airports, not one of the 4 where international travelers are supposed to show up at, that is Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal. They're landing across this country. People are essentially paying their way onto a private aircraft and could potentially be bypassing the quarantine requirements as a result. Does that concern you? Is this something your government is working to stop?
Yeah, I'm happy for the opportunity to explain how we are managing that. You're absolutely correct that all international commercial flights have been redirected to 4 main airports: Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. There are also 21 additional airports that do accept international flights. They are for small, usually propeller-type planes. And it's important to recognize that when people do fly into any one of those 21 smaller airports, and these are not commercial flights generally, although some people may charter a flight into a plane, they're still required to abide by all of the conditions that we've imposed. They have to bring with them a negative test. If they fail to do so, there's a very substantial fine. They're tested
why should you be allowed to pay thousands of dollars, buy your way onto a private plane and go to an airport that other people wouldn't be allowed to?
Now, you know what? Paying a fine is not paying your way past anything.
No, not paying a fine. I'm saying charter the actual plane to go to Winnipeg, a place that you can't fly into from an international departure point.
And in these small planes that may fly into, for example, Winnipeg or Hamilton or a number of other of the 21 airports I've mentioned, they are still required. There's no bypassing of anything. There's no loophole here. They're still required to submit a pre-departure tests taken within 72 hours from the country from which they've departed. So if they're flying in from the United States, the test has to be from the United States. If they were coming from any other country, the test would have to be from that country as well. They're then tested again upon arrival. They're all ordered into 14-day quarantine, and they're subject to a third test at day 8. The rules apply regardless of how you come to the country. We have put in place very strong measures to ensure that they're tested before they come, tested when they arrive. They're all ordered into quarantine. And failure to comply with any of those terms and conditions has very significant consequences.
Minister Blair, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks so much, David. Have a good day.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.